What's up everybody, back with some more PTR raid testing, and today we're taking a look at heroic Sylvanas Windrunner in the new raid Sanctum of Domination. Keep in mind this is not a guide on how to do the fight, and it is the first test on PTR for this encounter, so a lot of things can and most likely will change. I also want to give a big shout out to Lucid9797 on Twitch for helping me out with some of the footage for this fight so I could showcase all the faces. With that said, let's hop into it. So, Sylvanas, 3-phase fight, and there's a lot to cover. Starting off with phase 1, Sylvanas will use the appropriately named ability Windrunner, where she dashes across the room executing multiple abilities in quick succession, such as Withering Fire, Desecrating Shot, and Shadow Daggers. Now, Withering Fire seems to hit random players and inflicts them with a stack of Barbed Arrow, which is a stacking bleed that lasts until you've removed it with Domination Chains, which I'll go over in a bit. Desecrating Shot is a volley of arrows, aka swirls, that rain down across the encounter space in different patterns. Can be 3 lines, can be random cascades, etc, etc. If you get hit by one, you take a ton of damage. And Shadow Dagger is a dot that deals ticking damage every second over 9 seconds. Also hits several random players in the raid in this phase. And during all of this, like I mentioned, Sylvanas dashes around the room. However, you can still hit her, or rather the air where she originally was when she cast Windrunner, but more on that in a bit. Now, following this, you have Domination Chains. Fires several Domination Arrows indicated by big swirls, and after a bit, a Domination Arrow will land. If you get hit by the impact, you take a ton of damage. But more importantly, shortly after landing, this arrow will chain a player to it, and this seemed to always be the closest player. Now, this chain will deal ticking damage and pull in the chained player, and this pull-in effect will increase the longer the arrow is alive, as will the ticking damage you take. And if the chained player comes within 4 yards of the arrow, they take around 80k shadow damage, which is less than optimal. However, when you get chained, it also removes the barbed arrow bleed from the player. So this will be your bleed reset mechanic, so players will want to intentionally get chained if they have stacks of this bleed. And everyone in the raid will need to nuke down all the arrows that lands to keep the chained players from either getting pulled into the arrow or just die from ticking damage. Sylvanas will also teleport away and cast Veil of Darkness, which enshrouds a large portion of the room in a dark fog, aka big swirl. If you get hit, you take a ton of damage and you get 5 stacks of a healing absorb, roughly 30k while testing. However, 25% of all healing bypasses this absorb, and every second it's not out healed, it attempts to transfer 1 stack to a nearby player within 5 yards. So if multiple people get hit, or you're not fast with healing, etc, you can end up spreading this to a lot of players. However, during testing, this was like super easy to avoid. Big circle, don't be in it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you cannot move Sylvanas except after Veil of Darkness, where she hops to the current active tank. And on the topic of tanks, if you're out of melee range from Sylvanas, she will just shoot you instead. So you can effectively be anywhere in the room as long as you have aggro, which is both good and a huge headache, since you can't move her. Now, Sylvanas will get a stack of Ranger's Heartseeker every 5 seconds, and upon reaching 3 stacks, Sylvanas can, word being can, replace a ranger shot, her auto attack, with a triple burst of Heartseeker, which deals massive damage, like around 20k fizz and 16k magic damage per shot, and it gives you 1 stack of Banshee's Mark per arrow, which is an 18-second dot that also ticks for a lot. Now, this one hits like a freaking truck. At some point in the fight, she stacked up to 6 stacks of Ranger Heartseeker before firing off the Heartseeker burst. At which point she just fired off her triple shot 2 times in a row. You could tank swap in between if you were fast, and if you weren't, well, the tank pretty much exploded without heavy cooldowns. And she will also cast Wailing Arrow on a tank, which is your standard run out, explode, deals damage to raid based on distance. Now, when she hits 80% and intermission starts, Sylvanas will take 99% reduced damage and chain every player in the raid to a Domination Arrow. Now, on top of this, she will rip off literal chunks of Torghast and throw them towards players, aka a big line, and if you get hit you take around 250k damage, which is unavoidable, meaning you can't immune it. And along this Torghast chunky path, a ton of debris will follow in the form of more swirls on the ground. If you get hit by them, you also take a lot of damage. So the idea is kill off all the domination arrows while you avoid getting pulled into the one you're chained to, while having to dodge tons of swirls and big lines while you're getting pulled towards your arrow at an ever-increasing effect. And when you're done with the arrows, or after a certain amount of time, unsure which, she will cast Banshee's Wail, which is a 5-yard circle around every player in the raid and deals more damage the less health you have. At least that's how I'm reading the tooltip. It also interrupts you for 6 seconds if you're casting during it and silences you for 1 second when it goes off. When all of this is done, phase 2 begins and you get helped by Bolvar, Thrall, and Jaina, and you get teleported to a big old chain. Now, Thrall and Jaina will help you by creating earth or ice bridges, if you will, so you can cross over between chains as you chase Sylvanas. Now, throughout this phase, Sylvanas will mostly be immune to damage due to her Banshee Shroud, but she seemed to drop it every now and then, allowing players to smack her a bit. Now, I'm unsure if that's intended or not. In the journal, it says in the overview that you fight adds, and Sylvanas is in Banshee form, which means Banshee Shroud as well. So we'll see how that pans out in the end. Anyways, in phase 2, Sylvanas will fly around between chains and occasionally land to cast a few different abilities, like Banshee's Wail from Intermission, and Ruin, which is an interruptible cast that deals around 200k raid-wide damage if you do not interrupt it. She also uses Haunting Wave, where she fires off a ton of waves in every direction from her. Players hit get a stacking dot and get pushed back, potentially getting pushed off a chain or ledge. And she also uses Veil of Darkness and Shadow Dagger from phase 1 here. Now the big part of phase 2 is the Maw-Sworn commanders. There's a Vanguard, Hopebreaker, Soul Judge, Summoner, and Goliath Maw-Sworn, and these will spawn on different platforms as you make your way across the chain links, and you need to finish these off before Jaina and Thrall can put up more bridges. These adds all have their own set of abilities. Now I won't go into every single one for the sake of not making this video a year long, but it ranges from curses and debuff that needs to be dispelled, orbs that needs to be nuked down, random AoE damage, and tank slappers. The usual stuff. Seemed to be around 8 to 10 adds whenever they did spawn, so AoE pads. Now keep in mind, as you're dealing with all of the Maw-Sworn, Miss Banshee Queen will still use some of her aforementioned abilities like Veil of Darkness and Banshee Veil. So as you're fighting these adds, you'll also have to move out of the big darkness AoE, and the entire raid has to spread with the Veil, so it really looks like a cluster fudge. Fun one, but clustery nonetheless. And you keep crossing the chains and eventually phase 3 starts. Now I'm unsure if it's time-based or distance-based. I assume distance as you're running across chains. But when you've chased Sylvanas far enough, Jaina will teleport you to Oreos, and more precisely the Arbiter's Chamber, and phase 3 starts. In the Arbiter's Chamber you'll fight Sylvanas, but you also get to see the Jailer and bad boy Anduin. But let's go over the chamber a bit. There's 4 platforms players can go to here, as well as the middle platform where Anduin is. Now if players go to the middle platform, Anduin will smite the shit out of you and you die. However, players are able to jump between the 4 other platforms relatively safely to avoid or to deal with Sylvanas' various phase 3 abilities. So let's check those out. The big new mechanic here is the Bane arrows. Every now and then she will fire off Bane arrows that rain down on all 4 platforms, deals damage to players within 5 yards of their impact, but more importantly spawns a pool on the ground. If a player moves into a pool, they absorb it and get Banshee's Bane, which deals ticking shadow damage and stacks, meaning you should be able to soak multiple pools. Now, if you dispel a player with Banshee's Bane, a new pool will spawn. Now, I'm unsure if multiple pools spawn if you have more than 1 stack. I would assume so, but I'm unsure. Now, to keep players from just soaking him up and not dispelling it, there's Banshee's Fury, which is raid-wide ticking damage over 4 seconds, and after those 4 seconds, any player with Banshee's Bane erupts, dealing a large amount of raid-wide damage per stack. She will also destroy the current platform she's on after a bit with her Raise ability, meaning as the fight progresses, you'll have less and less space to deal with her mechanics. She also keeps some of her old abilities like Wailing Arrow, Veil of Darkness, Banshee Scream, and Shadow Dagger. And Shadow Dagger looked like it changed a bit for this phase, and these daggers just fire out in lines from Sylvanas now instead of hitting random targets. So pretty much the assumption here is have players soak the pools on all platforms that Sylvanas isn't on, bring him to her current one, dispel, get rid of him when she destroys the platform, and you use the other platforms to dodge stuff like Veil of Darkness and potentially Banshee's Scream depending on how much space you'll have or need. And well, that's pretty much phase 3, or what we've seen so far. Now this fight really took me by surprise. I mean, phase 1 was great, apart from boss movement, which was horrendous. And since you can't move boss, she'd sometimes just camp in AoEs and swirls, meaning melee and tank would just AFK. But I'm gonna assume that gets fixed. Maybe not the moving her part, but at least so she doesn't camp in AoEs. But phase 2 is what really surprised me. As in, I did not expect it to work that way, running between chain links, smacking swarms of ads. I really do love fights where the encounter space progresses or changes throughout the fight, but this takes it to another level. So I'm really looking forward to that part. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this first look of Sylvanas. I will cover all the bosses on PTR, and proper guides will be out once the raid is released. And I'm streaming all of the raid testing on PTR, so don't forget to check that out whenever there's raid testing announced. Otherwise, I'm streaming all of our main progression once it's live on Mondays and Tuesdays. Now, if you have any questions at all about this encounter or anything like that, hit me up in the comments or become a patron and get access to the Stankie Discord, where you can find raid week auras, healing notes, and you can get help with anything raiding related. Don't forget the usual stuff like comment, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.